Budour Hassan.
So in April of 2011, a famous megastar Egyptian blogger told Syrian revolutionaries that they need to raise Palestinian flags during the demonstrations on Friday, just to prove that they support the Palestinian resistance and to deny the narrative by the regime that the regime supports the Palestinian cause. Now I asked myself then, do Syrians have to do that? Do Syrians have to raise Palestinian flag just to prove that they support Palestine? Do Syrians have to show their nationalist credentials so the world supports their cause? And the answer was clear to me then. No, Syrians do not have to do that. Now, a Syrian friend told me at the start of the uprising that we avoided raising Palestinian flags and talking about Palestine, not because we don't support the Palestinian cause, but because this cause was exploited by the regime to a degree that turned it into a political tool. And we love Palestine so much that we don't agree to turn the cause into a political tool. And this is why we avoided using it. And I think that Syrians do not have to do this. I mean, Syrians do not have to wave a Palestinian flag to prove that they support us. Because Palestine is not a flag, definitely. Palestine is much more than that. Palestine is the refugees in Yarmouk camp who supported the revolution from the first day, who aided displaced Syrians, and who participated in protests, documented the uprising, and helped as much as they could. The revolution is also the Palestinian refugees in Al-Raml refugee camp in Latakia, who took a hard beating by the regime and had to deal with a heavy crackdown starting from July in 2011. And revolution lives not in the palaces of the regime, nor than in the speeches of a resistance leader who thinks that just because he leads a resistance movement, this gives him the right to speak in the name of Palestinians and to kill people, innocent people in Syria, not just in the name of resistance, but also in the name of Palestine. So this is why I think that Syrians do not have to prove anything to anyone. Secondly, even if we suppose that the Syrian regime does in fact support the Palestinian resistance, does it mean that this allows the Syrian regime to control Syria, to prevent people from expressing their opinions, to kill and torture hundreds of thousands of Syrians just because they dared say no to more than 40 years of oppression, to more than 40 years of injustice? Of course not. Even if Bashar al-Assad were the only person capable of liberating Palestine, I will not support him. And I'm sure that many Palestinians will not do either. Because our liberation cannot be established on the enslavement of another people, particularly when this enslavement is an enslavement of our sisters and brothers in Syria. And in fact, the truth is that the Syrian regime has never truly supported Palestine. For the Syrian regime, Palestine has always been a fig leaf and always been a political tool. And it started from the 1970s when the Syrian regime helped other militias in Lebanon to crack down on the refugee in Tel Zatar. The siege and massacre in Tel Zatar cannot be forgotten. And the massacres that the regime helped Amal party in Lebanon commit in the 1980s also against refugees in Lebanon and against the PLO cannot be forgotten either. And the siege that the regime is imposing in Yarmouk refugee camp, preventing people from getting medical aid or baby milk, preventing people from going in and out of the refugee camp, cannot be tolerated and cannot be just ignored, as many are doing, unfortunately, just because they think that this regime is for resistance and this regime is for the human rights of Palestinians. Now, the thing is that me as a Palestinian, I don't need to say this for many people just to convince them about the justice of the Syrian cause. Because in my opinion, it's very clear that this revolution was a revolution for freedom and dignity. But unfortunately for many of us here in Palestine, because there is that polarization among Palestinians, as is the case in many other Arab countries about the Syrian regime, we had to say it once over and over again and to try to convince our comrades or our former comrades that they need to stop supporting the Syrian regime, that all we hear about the Syrian regime's support of resistance is nothing but just propaganda. Now, unfortunately, it didn't really help. people mostly stick to their opinions regarding the regime. There is, if we want to talk about what the reaction of Palestinians towards the Syrian revolution, it varies. Unfortunately, the left, mostly the mainstream left, supports the Assad regime. And here lies the irony, because one of the most supportive parties of the Assad regime is called the Israeli Communist Party. And its name is the Israeli Communist Party, and it supports the regime because it says, well, this regime is against imperialism. But at the same time, these people had absolutely no problem in participating in protests alongside Zionists in Tel Aviv. Liberal Zionists in Tel Aviv, for instance. So how can you say that you support the Syrian regime because it's against imperialism, and on the other hand participate in protests with Zionists? And also there are others who say that we supported the Syrian revolution when it was non-violent, but then after it got violent, we couldn't support it anymore and it was hijacked. So yes, the Syrian revolution was indeed hijacked. And we know that there are many jihadists and many other groups and many pro-America and pro-imperialist groups that try to hijack the Syrian revolution. But that does not by any means tarnish the Syrian revolution. And it also doesn't mean that just because a revolutionary movement was hijacked, it means that we should stand in the sideline and stop supporting it. Of course, there is still so many revolutionaries still working on the ground. Many of them are non-violent, and even there are many non-sectarian armed brigades that we cannot ignore. If the revolution was hijacked, we don't just go and start blaming the people for it being hijacked. We actually do everything to side with the people in order to get the revolution back on the right track. And this is what many leftists couldn't understand. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you have the right-wingers and the Islamists who support the Syrian revolution, but not truly because they believe in their right to freedom and dignity, but because they think that it is a Sunni uprising against an Alawite regime. Now, this is why for me it was very hard to participate in protests organized by Islamists in support of the revolution, because for me it is, although of course there are religious movements inside the revolution, it's still a revolution for freedom, equality, social justice and dignity. And this is why I cannot agree with the line of the Islamists here in Palestine who support the revolution just because they see it as Sunni versus Alawite. Now, there is a small section among the Palestinian left that supports the Syrian revolution that doesn't Syrians about what they have to do and how they failed. And we managed to organize few protests in Haifa, for instance, in Jerusalem, and in other places in Palestine. Although there were small protests, I think it meant a lot for us to show Syrian people that yes, there are people in Palestine who stand with you, and there are people who don't buy into the regime propaganda. I mean, it says a lot that in Syria right now there is a branch, an intelligence branch, one of the most notorious intelligence branches in Syria. It's called Palestine. It means that there are people being tortured, including Palestinians, by the way. They are being tortured in the name of Palestine, in the name of our country, in the name of our cause, the cause that we believe is a cause for freedom. Now, to those Palestinians and to those pro-Palestinians who believe that the Syrian regime is truly supportive of Palestine and who do not support the revolution, who stand on the side and say, no, we don't want to support the revolution, or who remain neutral, I say, you have a Palestine and I have my own. Your Palestine is an intelligence branch in Damascus that kills and tortures people, while my Palestine is Khalid Bakrawi, the martyr from the Yarmouk refugee camp who was arrested and tortured to death. Your Palestine is a speech by Bashar al-Assad, while my Palestine is a chance of Syrian freedom fighters in Hama. Your Palestine is just empty rhetorics, while my Palestine is people in Bustan al-Qasr raising the picture of Samir Isawi, the hunger-striking prisoner. My Palestine is people from the north to the south chanting in solidarity with Gaza during the recent war on Gaza last year and saying, "Oh Gaza, we are with you till death." They did it when they were bombarded by the Assad regime and they were shelled. My Palestine is that of the Syrian revolutionary youth in Damascus who raised a pamphlet in solidarity with the Palestinians in the Naqab and say, "Proverb shall not pass." So Syrian revolutionaries, even when they face the most terrible cases of torture, of persecution, and of crackdown, they still remember their sisters and brothers in Palestine. They still chant in solidarity with them and do not forget about the prisoners. So I think it's very important to remember that, and to remember the hundreds of thousands of Syrian and Palestinian prisoners who still languish in regime jails. For example, Ali Shihad, the communist Palestinian who has been detained in Syrian regime jails for almost a year. And Maher al-Jaji, also another youth activist from Yarmouk refugee camp, who has been detained by the Syrian regime for more than a year, and no one knows whether what about his case now. Also, we will not forget the martyr Anas Amara, who was murdered simply because he was trying to get aid into Yarmouk refugee camp and try to break the siege. And my Palestine also is that of Jihad As'ad Muhammad, the Syrian journalist, who even prior to the Syrian revolution was always writing in solidarity with Palestine, and who, like many others, did not believe that this Palestine is Bashar al-Assad's Palestine, but this is a cause that interests all Arabs. So I just ask, one last thing, I just ask people who think that Bashar al-Assad supports Palestine or still believe his propaganda, just go over history a little bit, read more about what he and his father did to Palestine and to the Palestinian camps. And even if you are not convinced, don't let this fact, don't let political gains affect your support of the Syrian revolution, because it's obviously not about geopolitics. We do not know whether if the revolution wins in Syria, how that will affect the Palestinian cause. It might indeed damage us, I do not know, but I do not care on the other hand, because my support of the Syrian revolution is unconditional. And I do believe that even though it's getting more and more complicated, and despite all the terrible groups that are trying to hijack the Syrian revolution, especially the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq, which we obviously oppose like so many Syrians, the same Syrians who protested against the regime and are also protesting against the Islamic State. So I have faith in these people. I have faith in a woman like Su'ad Nofel. I have faith in those who are still resilient and steadfast in Damascus, and in Daraa, the birthplace of the revolution, and in Aleppo, and in Salamiyye, the fantastic city that has been protesting since the first days of the uprising. So I have faith in these people that even though things are getting more and more complicated, that they can manage to keep the uprising going. And even if this means bad things for my cause, I really do not care. What I care is the freedom and dignity of my Syrian sisters and brothers, and to reject that my name or my country or my cause be used or co-opted by the Syrian regime to kill and persecute my sisters and brothers in Syria.